The medical kit felt impossibly heavy in Private Danny Kowalski's trembling hands, not because of its weight, but because everyone in Charlie Company knew he'd probably drop it when it mattered most. "Again, Kowalski!" Staff Sergeant Rivera's voice cut through the humid air at Camp Liberty, Iraq, like a blade. "And this time, try not to fumble the supplies when someone's life depends on it." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Danny's hands shook as he attempted to reload the medical pack for the fourth time that morning. Around him, the other soldiers in his unit watched with expressions ranging from barely concealed frustration to outright annoyance. Some had given up watching altogether, finding more interesting things to focus on than Danny's latest struggle with basic combat medic procedures, at 5 feet 6 inches and barely 140 pounds soaking wet. Danny looked more like a high school student who'd wandered onto a military base by mistake than a soldier deployed in one of the most dangerous regions of Iraq. His oversized helmet constantly slipped down over his eyes. His body armor hung loose despite multiple adjustments, and his rifle seemed to dwarf his slight frame. But it wasn't just his size that made his fellow soldiers doubt his capabilities. It was the constant stream of small mistakes that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Kowalski, you've got medical supplies scattered all over the ground," Rivera observed, his weathered face showing the kind of patience that was running dangerously thin. In a real combat situation, wounded soldiers don't have time to wait well. "You pick up bandages you've dropped in the dirt." Danny scrambled to collect the scattered medical supplies, his face burning with embarrassment as several soldiers snickered behind him. He'd been with Charlie Company for 8 months now, ever since completing his combat medic training at Fort Sam Houston, and he still felt like an outsider looking in. Every drill, every exercise, every routine procedure seemed to highlight his inadequacies rather than build his confidence. "I can do this, Sergeant," Danny said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "I just need more practice." Rivera walked closer, his boots crunching on the gravel of the training area. "Practice? Son, you've had 8 months of practice. At some point, we need to see results." He gestured toward the medical dummy they'd been using for trauma training. "That dummy has been bleeding out for 10 minutes while you've been organizing supplies. In a real firefight, that soldier would be dead." The words hit Danny like a physical blow. He'd joined the army specifically to save lives, inspired by stories his grandfather had told him about medics in Vietnam who'd risked everything to help their wounded comrades. But instead of becoming the hero he'd imagined, Danny felt like he was becoming a liability his unit couldn't afford to carry. Specialist Marcus Thompson, a massive soldier from Alabama who served as the unit's automatic weapons specialist, spoke up from where he was cleaning his M249. "Sarge, maybe we should request a replacement. I mean, no disrespect to Kowalski, but when we're out there on patrol and someone gets hit, we need a medic who can handle the pressure." Several other soldiers murmured agreement. Danny felt his stomach clench into a familiar knot of anxiety and self-doubt. These weren't cruel people. They were soldiers who depended on each other for survival. Their concerns weren't personal. They were practical. And Danny couldn't honestly say their worries were unfounded. "The thing is," continued Thompson, "we're heading into some serious territory next week. Intelligence reports are showing increased insurgent activity along Route Tampa. If something goes wrong out there, we need every member of this unit performing at 100%. Danny knew about Route Tampa, a stretch of highway that had earned the nickname Death Road among the soldiers at Camp Liberty. Improvised explosive devices were common, ambushes were frequent, and medical evacuations were often complicated by continued enemy fire. It was exactly the kind of environment where a medic's skills could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. "Look, Kowalski," Rivera said, his voice softening slightly, "I know you want to help. I know you care about your fellow soldiers. But caring isn't enough. When bullets start flying and men are bleeding, I need a medic who can work under pressure, who won't freeze up when things get chaotic. Danny straightened his shoulders, trying to project more confidence. Then he felt, "Sergeant, I understand your concerns. But I didn't come here to sit on the sidelines. I came here to save lives." "Then prove it," Rivera replied simply. "Tomorrow morning, 0600 hours, we're running a full combat simulation. Multiple casualties, hostile fire, chaos, the works. If you can successfully treat and evacuate 3 wounded soldiers under those conditions, maybe we'll talk about including you in next week's mission." The training area fell silent except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional shout from other units conducting their own exercises. Danny felt the weight of everyone's stares, the pressure of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. 3 wounded soldiers in a combat simulation. It sounded impossible. "What happens if I can't do it?" Danny asked, though he dreaded the answer. Rivera's expression was neutral, but his eyes held a hint of sympathy. "Then you'll be reassigned to base medical, where you can help wounded soldiers in a controlled environment. No shame in that. Kowalski, not everyone is cut out for combat operations." Danny thought about his grandfather, who had earned a Bronze Star for repeatedly running into enemy fire to rescue wounded Marines during the Tet Offensive. He thought about the letters he'd sent home to his mother in Cleveland, full of optimism about making a difference in the lives of his fellow soldiers. He thought about all the reasons he'd become a medic in the first place. "I'll be ready, Sergeant," Danny said, his voice stronger now. "I'll be there at 0600. Rivera nodded curtly. "Good, but understand this, Kowalski. Tomorrow isn't just about proving you can handle medical procedures under pressure. It's about proving you can be trusted with the lives of your brothers. These men," he gestured around the assembled soldiers, "need to know that if they get hit, their medic won't let them down." As the training session broke up and soldiers began heading back to their barracks, Danny remained behind, staring at the scattered medical supplies still lying on the ground. He'd cleaned them up and repacked them dozens of times during training. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Specialist Sarah Chun, the unit's communications specialist, approached as Danny began collecting his gear. Chun was one of the few soldiers who'd never openly criticized his performance, though she'd never exactly defended him either. "You sure about this, Danny?" she asked quietly. "Rivera's simulations are brutal. Even experienced medics struggle with his scenarios." Danny looked at her, noting the genuine concern in her expression. "I have to try, Sarah. This is what I trained for. This is why I'm here." Chun nodded slowly. "All right. For what it's worth, I think you're tougher than people give you credit for. You just need to believe it yourself." It was a small kindness, but Danny held onto it as he walked back toward the barracks. The late afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete and metal structures of Camp Liberty, and the air was thick with dust and the smell of diesel fuel. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of convoys heading out on patrol, and the occasional crack of rifle fire from other training areas. That night, Danny lay in his narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling of the temporary housing unit he shared with 5 other soldiers. The air conditioning struggled against the Iraqi heat, creating a constant low hum that should have been soothing but instead seemed to amplify his racing thoughts. Thompson was in the bunk next to him, and Danny could hear him talking quietly on his satellite phone to someone back home. His wife, probably, or maybe his young daughter he was always showing pictures of. The conversation was intimate and loving, full of promises to be careful and assurances that he'd be home soon. Danny thought about the responsibility he'd be carrying tomorrow. These weren't just fellow soldiers. They were fathers, husbands, sons, brothers. They had families waiting for them, dreams they wanted to fulfill, futures they were fighting to protect. If he failed tomorrow, he wasn't just letting down his unit. He was potentially putting at risk the most precious things in these men's lives. But lying there in the darkness, Danny also thought about why he'd become a medic. It wasn't because he was the strongest or the fastest or the most natural soldier. It was because he genuinely cared about helping people, about being there when others needed him most. He'd always been the kind of person who stopped to help injured animals, who volunteered at hospitals during high school, who chose a career path dedicated to healing rather than harming. Maybe that was enough. Maybe caring deeply, combined with proper training and determination, could overcome the physical limitations that everyone seemed so focused on. Tomorrow would tell. The alarm would buzz at 0530, giving him 30 minutes to prepare before the most important test of his military career. But tonight, Danny made a promise to himself and to his sleeping comrades. Tomorrow, he would prove that sometimes the soldier who looks least capable of carrying others is exactly the one who will refuse to leave anyone behind. Danny's alarm buzzed at 0530, but he'd been awake for hours, his mind cycling through every medical procedure he'd ever learned. The barracks were still dark, filled with the quiet sounds of sleeping soldiers, but Danny slipped out of his bunk and began his preparation ritual. He dressed methodically, double-checking every piece of equipment, every supply in his medical kit, every detail that might make the difference between success and failure. The mess hall was nearly empty when Danny grabbed a quick breakfast, scrambled eggs, and toast that tasted like cardboard in his dry mouth. He forced himself to eat, knowing he'd need the energy for whatever Rivera had planned. Other soldiers filtered in gradually, most heading to their regular duty assignments, but a few shooting curious glances in Danny's direction. Word had spread quickly through the unit about the morning simulation. By 0550, a crowd had gathered near the combat simulation area on the eastern edge of Camp Liberty. Danny spotted familiar faces from not just his own unit, but from other companies as well. Apparently, news of the weakest medic's test had traveled beyond Charlie Company. Some soldiers looked genuinely interested in the outcome, while others were the expressions of people expecting to witness an inevitable disaster. Rivera stood near the entrance to the simulation area with a clipboard and stopwatch, flanked by two other NCOs Danny didn't recognize, probably brought in to play wounded soldiers and ensure the scenario remained realistic. The simulation area itself was a maze of concrete barriers, abandoned vehicles, and artificial debris designed to replicate urban combat conditions. "Kowalski," Rivera called out as Danny approached, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "You ready for this?" Danny adjusted his medical pack one final time, checking that his rifle was properly slung and his communications equipment was functioning. "Ready, Sergeant." "All right, here's the scenario," Rivera announced loudly enough for the spectators to hear. "You're part of a patrol that's been hit by an IED and small arms fire. 3 soldiers are down with various injuries. Your job is to assess, treat, and prepare all 3 for evacuation while under simulated enemy fire. You have 20 minutes to complete the scenario successfully." Danny's heart rate spiked. 20 minutes to treat 3 casualties while avoiding simulated gunfire. It was an ambitious timeline, even for experienced medics. He'd run similar scenarios during training, but never with this level of pressure, this many witnesses, and stakes this high. "Casualties will be positioned at different locations throughout the simulation area," Rivera continued. "You'll need to locate each one, assess their condition, provide appropriate treatment, and signal for evacuation. Any questions?" Danny shook his head. "No questions, Sergeant." "Good, because I want everyone here to understand what we're testing today. This isn't just about medical knowledge. Any medic fresh out of training has the book knowledge. This is about performing under pressure, making life or death decisions quickly, and having the physical and mental fortitude to carry wounded soldiers to safety when everything around you is falling apart." Rivera's words hung in the air like A challenge. Danny could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, measuring him, expecting him to fail. Thompson was there, along with Chun and most of the other soldiers from his unit. He recognized faces from Alpha Company and Bravo Company, soldiers who'd heard stories about his struggles and had come to witness what many expected to be his final attempt at proving himself worthy of combat operations. "One more thing," Rivera added, and Danny detected a hint of something, not quite sympathy, but perhaps recognition of the pressure Danny was under. In combat, medics often have to make impossible choices. Sometimes you can't save everyone. Sometimes you have to prioritize. Sometimes you have to risk your own life to save others. Today's scenario will test all of those realities. Danny nodded, understanding the implication. This wouldn't just be about technical medical skills. It would be about judgment, courage, and the willingness to put others before himself, even when success seemed impossible. "Timer starts when you enter the simulation area," Rivera announced, raising his whistle. "Remember, 20 minutes for 3 casualties, simulated hostile fire throughout, and everyone here will be watching to see if you're ready for real combat operations." Danny took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever deity might be listening, and stepped toward the entrance to the simulation area. Behind him, he could hear murmured conversations among the spectators, some encouraging, others skeptical. Most simply curious about whether the smallest soldier in Charlie Company had what it took to save lives under fire. The whistle shrieked, and Danny plunged into the maze of concrete barriers and artificial debris that represented his first real test as a combat medic. The simulation area was designed to be disorienting. Smoke machines created limited visibility, loudspeakers blasted. The sounds of gunfire and explosions and flashing lights simulated muzzle flashes and incoming rounds. Danny had to force himself to move methodically rather than panicking in the chaos, using the techniques he'd learned during training to scan for casualties while maintaining situational awareness. The first wounded soldier was located behind an overturned Humvee about 50 meters from the entrance. As Danny approached, he could see it was Specialist Rodriguez from Alpha Company, lying motionless with what appeared to be a severe leg wound. Fake blood covered his lower extremities, and he was doing an excellent job of simulating a soldier. In shock, "Rodriguez, can you hear me?" Danny called out as he slid into position beside the wounded soldier. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay with me." Rodriguez's eyes fluttered open, and he grabbed Danny's arm weakly. "Can't feel my legs, Doc. Is it bad?" Danny quickly assessed the simulated wounds. The scenario called for a compound fracture of the left femur with significant blood loss, a serious injury that would require immediate stabilization and pain management. Working quickly but carefully, Danny applied a pressure dressing to control the bleeding, splinted the injured leg, and started in 4 for fluid replacement. "You're going to be fine," Danny told Rodriguez as he worked, his voice steady despite the simulated gunfire crackling around them. "I need to check on 2 more casualties, but I'll be back for you. Can you maintain pressure on this dressing?" Rodriguez nodded weakly, and Danny moved on to locate the second casualty. The smoke and noise made navigation difficult, and he had to backtrack twice before finding the correct route through the maze of obstacles. Time was ticking away, and he could feel the pressure mounting with each passing minute. The second casualty was positioned in an even more challenging location, behind a concrete barrier that required Danny to low crawl under simulated enemy fire to reach. When he arrived, he found Sergeant Williams from Bravo Company, conscious, but with what appeared to be a serious chest wound. "Thank God," Williams gasped as Danny slid into position beside him. "Thought I was going to bleed out before anyone found me." Danny's assessment revealed a simulated sucking chest wound, a pneumothorax that would be fatal if not treated immediately. Working with practiced efficiency, he cleaned the wound area, applied an occlusive dressing to seal the chest cavity, and monitored Williams' breathing to ensure the treatment was effective. "Breathing easier?" Danny asked as he finished the primary treatment. Williams nodded, his acting convincing enough to make Danny feel genuine relief. "Yeah, Doc, much better. You know what you're doing." Danny checked his watch. 12 minutes. Elapsed, 8 minutes remaining, and he still had one more casualty to locate and treat. The pressure was mounting, but he felt a growing confidence in his abilities. The technical skills were there. He just had to trust his training and keep moving. The third casualty proved to be the most challenging to locate. Danny spent precious minutes searching through the simulation area before finally spotting movement behind a pile of debris in the far corner. When he reached the location, he found Private Jackson from his own unit, apparently unconscious with what looked like a head injury. "Jackson, can you hear me?" Danny called out, gently shaking the soldier's shoulder. When there was no response, he immediately began a neurological assessment, checking pupil response, testing for spinal injuries, and evaluating the severity of the head trauma. The simulated wound was serious, a significant laceration across Jackson's forehead with possible concussion. Danny cleaned the wound, applied appropriate dressings, and positioned Jackson's head to maintain an open airway while protecting his spine. This type of injury required extreme care during evacuation to prevent further damage. With all three casualties assessed and treated, Danny faced his final challenge, signaling for evacuation and ensuring all three wounded soldiers could be safely transported. The simulation required him to establish a secure landing zone for helicopter evacuation, which meant clearing debris and providing security while maintaining care for his patients. Working frantically against the clock, Danny used hand signals to indicate the evacuation zone to the simulated helicopter crew, then began the delicate process of moving his casualties to the designated area. Rodriguez, despite his leg injury, could move with assistance. Williams, with his chest wound stabilized, could walk slowly with support. But Jackson, with his potential spinal injury, would require careful carrying on a backboard. The timer showed 2 minutes remaining as Danny began the evacuation process. He helped Rodriguez and Williams reach the evacuation zone, then returned. For Jackson, the unconscious soldier was dead weight, and maneuvering him onto a backboard while maintaining spinal precautions was challenging even under ideal conditions. With simulated enemy fire continuing around him and time running out, it seemed nearly impossible. But Danny had learned something important during the scenario. When he focused on helping others rather than worrying about his own limitations, his hands stopped shaking, his movements became more confident, and his medical training took over. He wasn't the biggest or strongest soldier in Charlie Company, but he was determined to be the most careful and thorough medic they'd ever seen. 30 seconds remaining on the timer. Danny successfully loaded Jackson onto the backboard and signaled for final evacuation. The simulation ended with all three casualties properly treated and ready for transport. A complete success that left Danny exhausted but exhilarated. The whistle blew, indicating the end of the scenario, and the simulation area fell silent. Except for the sound of Danny's heavy breathing, he'd done it. Against all odds and expectations, he'd successfully completed Rivera's brutal combat medic simulation. From outside the simulation area, Danny could hear voices, some surprised, others impressed, a few skeptical about whether the scenario had been made easier for him. But as he emerged from the maze of barriers and smoke, he saw Rivera approaching with his stopwatch and clipboard, wearing an expression Danny had never seen before. "Well, Kowalski," Rivera said slowly, studying his notes. "That was unexpected." Rivera studied his stopwatch and notes for what felt like an eternity while Danny stood catching his breath, his uniform soaked with sweat and streaked with dust from crawling through the simulation area. The crowd of spectators had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around the two men as they awaited the official verdict. 19 minutes 43 seconds. Rivera announced, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled soldiers. All 3 casualties were properly assessed, treated according to protocol, and successfully evacuated. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Danny could see surprise on many faces. Thompson's eyebrows had shot up nearly to his hairline, and even Chun looked genuinely shocked by the results. Several soldiers from other units were shaking their heads, clearly having expected a very different outcome. However, Rivera continued, and Danny's heart sank at the qualifier he knew was coming. Completing a controlled simulation isn't the same as performing under real combat conditions. Any medic can follow procedures when the bullets are actually trying to kill them. Private Martinez from Bravo Company spoke up from the crowd. Sarge, with all due respect, that simulation was brutal. I've seen experienced medics fail Rivera's scenarios. Maybe Kowalski's got more in him than we thought. Maybe, Rivera replied, but his tone remained skeptical. Or maybe he just had a good day. One successful training exercise doesn't erase 8 months of dropped supplies, fumbled procedures, and general uncertainty under pressure. Danny felt the familiar sting of dismissal, the same feeling he'd carried since arriving at Camp Liberty. Even when he succeeded, it was treated as an anomaly rather than proof of his capabilities. He understood Rivera's caution. Combat medics dealt with real lives, real blood, real death, but the constant doubt was wearing him down. What do I need to do to prove myself, Sergeant? Danny asked, his voice steadier than he felt. I completed your simulation successfully. I saved 3 casualties under pressure. What more do you want from me? Rivera studied Danny's face for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. You want to know what I want, Kowalski? I want to see you perform when it's not a simulation. When there's real blood, real screaming, real terror. When someone's life actually depends on whether you can keep your hands from shaking long enough to stop arterial bleeding. Then give me that chance, Danny replied immediately. Include me in next week's patrol. Let me prove I can handle real combat conditions. A few soldiers in the crowd exchanged glances. The patrol Rivera had mentioned was particularly dangerous, a sweep through an area known for heavy insurgent activity, with multiple checkpoints along Route Tampa where IEDs were common and ambushes frequent. It wasn't the kind of mission where units typically brought along soldiers of questionable capability. Thompson stepped forward from the crowd. Sarge, maybe we should consider it. I mean, the kid did just complete your simulation flawlessly. And we're going to need a medic on that patrol anyway. The kid? Danny turned toward Thompson, surprised by what sounded almost like support from the soldier who'd been most vocal about his inadequacies. You've been saying for months that I'm not ready for combat operations. Thompson shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. Look, Kowalski, I still think you're too small and too nervous for infantry work, but what I saw in that simulation, that was solid medical work. Fast, efficient, thorough. Maybe I was wrong about your skills as a medic. Other soldiers began voicing opinions, creating a buzz of conversation around the training area. Some remained skeptical, pointing out that simulations couldn't replicate the psychological pressure of actual combat. Others argued that Danny had demonstrated competence and deserved a real opportunity to prove himself. Chun moved closer to the center of the discussion. I've been thinking about this differently, she said, her voice cutting through the other conversations. Maybe Danny's size isn't a disadvantage for a medic. He can get into tight spaces, move through areas where larger soldiers might get stuck. In urban combat, that could be an asset. Interesting point, Rivera mused, though his expression remained neutral. Urban environments do present unique challenges for casualty evacuation. Sergeant Williams, who had played one of the wounded soldiers in the simulation, joined the conversation. I have to say, Kowalski's bedside manner during the scenario was impressive. Even knowing it was just training, he kept me calm, explained what he was doing, and made me feel like I was in good hands. That kind of confidence can make a real difference when someone's been hit. Danny felt a warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the Iraqi heat. For the first time since arriving at Camp Liberty, soldiers were discussing his potential contributions rather than his limitations. It wasn't universal acceptance. He could see plenty of doubtful faces in the crowd, but it was progress. "There's another consideration," Rivera said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The patrol next week is going through some of the most dangerous territory in our sector. Intel reports suggest increased insurgent activity, possible roadside bombs, maybe even coordinated ambush attempts. I need every soldier on that patrol to be absolutely reliable." "Which is exactly why you should include Danny," Martinez argued. "If someone gets hit in that kind of environment, you want the best possible medical care available immediately. Hospital evacuation might not be possible if we're pinned down by enemy fire." Rivera looked around the assembled soldiers, seeming to gauge the mood of the group. Danny could see the internal struggle playing out on the sergeant's face, balancing legitimate concerns about combat readiness against growing evidence that his assumptions about Danny's capabilities might have been wrong. "All right," Rivera said finally, and Danny's heart began racing. "Here's what we're going to do. Kowalski, you'll be included in next week's patrol, but with conditions." Danny nodded eagerly, willing to accept almost any terms that would get him into the field with his unit. "First," Rivera continued, "you'll carry extra medical supplies beyond the standard loadout. If we encounter casualties, I want you prepared for anything from minor wounds to major trauma. Second, you'll be partnered with Thompson for the duration of the mission. He'll provide security while you work, and he'll evaluate your performance under actual combat conditions." Thompson looked surprised by this assignment, but nodded his acceptance. "I can work with that, Sarge." Third, Rivera's voice became more stern. "If you freeze up, if you hesitate, if you show any sign that you can't handle the pressure, you'll be pulled from combat duties permanently. No more chances, no more simulations. You'll finish your deployment in the base medical facility, treating routine ailments and minor injuries." Danny felt the weight of that ultimatum. This was it, his one real opportunity to prove he belonged with his unit in combat operations. Success would validate everything he'd worked toward. Failure would end his dreams of being a combat medic permanently. "I understand, Sergeant," Danny replied. "I won't let you down." "See that you don't," Rivera said. "Because it's not just about letting me down. It's about letting down every soldier who might depend on you when they're bleeding and calling for a medic." The crowd began dispersing as soldiers headed off to their various duties, but several approached Danny with words of encouragement or advice. Rodriguez, still limping slightly from his role in the simulation, clapped Danny on the shoulder. "You did good work there, Doc," Rodriguez said. "When you were treating my wound, I actually started believing I was really injured. That kind of focus and confidence, that's what wounded soldiers need to see." Jackson, who had played the unconscious casualty with the head injury, was more direct in his assessment. "Look, Kowalski, I'm not going to pretend I haven't had doubts about your abilities. But the way you handled that spinal injury scenario, you were careful, thorough, professional. If I ever really get hit out there, I'd be glad to have you working on me." Even some of the soldiers from other units offered encouragement before leaving. Word of Danny's successful simulation would spread throughout Camp Liberty, changing perceptions and raising expectations. The pressure was mounting, but for the first time since arriving in Iraq, Danny felt like he was being judged on his actual performance rather than just his physical appearance. Thompson lingered after most of the crowd had dispersed, studying Danny with a new expression, not quite respect, but something approaching professional consideration. "Listen, Kowalski," Thompson said quietly. "I want you to know I wasn't trying to be cruel with my comments about your size and nervousness. In combat, Soldiers depend on each other completely. Any weakness in the chain can get people killed. I understand, Danny replied. I know you were looking out for the unit. Right, but after watching you work in that simulation, I'm thinking maybe I misjudged what your strengths and weaknesses actually are. Thompson paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. You're never going to be the biggest or strongest soldier in the unit, but you might be the most careful and thorough medic we've got. Danny felt a surge of gratitude toward the big soldier who'd been one of his harshest critics. Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot coming from you. Don't thank me yet, Thompson replied with a slight smile. Wait until we're both back from next week's patrol in one piece. Then you can thank me. As Thompson walked away, Danny remained in the training area for a few more minutes, reflecting on everything that had just happened. The successful simulation had opened a door, but walking through that door would require performing under real combat conditions with real lives at stake. He thought about his grandfather's stories from Vietnam, about the medics who'd saved his life during the Tet Offensive. Those men had faced similar challenges, earning the trust of their units, proving their worth under fire, demonstrating that courage came in many different forms. The next week would determine whether Danny Kowalski had inherited that same courage or whether his successful simulation had been nothing more than a lucky performance that couldn't be repeated when it truly mattered. But for the first time since arriving at Camp Liberty, Danny felt genuinely optimistic about his chances. The simulation had shown him something important. When he focused on helping others rather than worrying about himself, his medical training took over and his hands stopped shaking. Now he just had to prove he could do the same thing when the bullets were real and the blood wasn't fake. The week between the simulation and the actual patrol felt like the longest of Danny's military career. Every morning brought the same routine of equipment checks, medical supply inventory, and combat readiness drills, but now each activity carried added significance. This wasn't just routine training, it was preparation for his one chance to prove himself worthy of serving alongside his fellow soldiers in genuine combat operations. Danny threw himself into preparation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He memorized the specifications of every piece of medical equipment in his kit, practiced battlefield triage procedures until he could perform them blindfolded, and studied detailed maps of the patrol route until he knew every checkpoint, every potential danger area, every possible evacuation point along Route Tampa. The other soldiers in Charlie Company seemed to be watching him differently now. The successful simulation had shifted perceptions, but not eliminated skepticism. Some, like Rodriguez and Jackson, offered genuine encouragement and practical advice about combat operations. Others maintained their doubts but kept them to themselves, waiting to see how Danny would perform when the stakes were real. Thompson proved to be an unexpectedly valuable mentor during the preparation week. Despite his previous criticisms, the big soldier began sharing insights about combat tactics, situational awareness, and the psychological challenges of operating under enemy fire. Their partnership for the upcoming mission had transformed from a burden into something approaching genuine collaboration. The thing about combat, Thompson explained during one of their equipment preparation sessions, is that everything happens faster than training prepares you for, but also somehow slower than you expect. Your mind speeds up, but your body feels like it's moving through thick mud. The soldiers who survive are the ones who can stay focused on their job despite all the chaos around them. Danny absorbed every piece of advice, every tactical insight, every psychological preparation tip that Thompson and the other experienced soldiers shared. He understood that knowledge alone wouldn't guarantee success, but he was determined to eliminate every possible source of failure that could be controlled through preparation. The patrol briefing came on Sunday evening, delivered by Captain Morrison. In the unit's cramped briefing room, 12 soldiers would participate in the mission, Rivera leading the patrol. Thompson providing heavy weapons support, Chun handling communications, Danny serving as the unit medic, and 8 other soldiers from Charlie Company filling various tactical roles. Our primary objective, Morrison began, spreading a large map across the briefing table, is to conduct a presence patrol along Route Tampa from Checkpoint Alpha to Checkpoint Delta, with particular attention to areas where intelligence reports suggest possible IED placement. Danny studied the map intently, noting the terrain features, urban areas, and potential ambush sites along their planned route. Route Tampa stretched for nearly 15 miles through some of the most contested territory in their sector, passing through 3 small Iraqi towns and several agricultural areas where insurgents were known to operate. Secondary objectives include liaison with local Iraqi police at checkpoints Bravo and Charlie, and intelligence gathering regarding recent insurgent activity in the region, Morrison continued. Expected duration is 8 to 10 hours with departure at 06:00 tomorrow morning. Rivera took over the tactical portion of the briefing, outlining patrol formations, communication protocols, and contingency plans for various emergency scenarios. Danny paid particular attention to the medical evacuation procedures, noting the locations of potential helicopter landing zones and the radio frequencies for requesting air support. The weather forecast calls for clear skies and temperatures reaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit, Rivera announced. Hydration will be critical, especially for soldiers carrying heavy equipment loads. Kowalski, that includes you. You'll be carrying extra medical supplies in addition to your standard combat load. Danny nodded, though he was already concerned about the physical demands of the mission. His medical kit, combined with additional trauma supplies, extra 4 fluids, and emergency medications, would add nearly 40 pounds to his standard equipment load. For a soldier of his size, that represented a significant physical challenge over the course of a 10-hour patrol. Rules of engagement remain standard for this sector, Morrison continued. You are authorized to use deadly force to protect yourselves and Iraqi civilians from imminent threat. However, we're conducting a presence patrol, not a search and destroy mission. Avoid unnecessary confrontation, but be prepared to respond aggressively if attacked. The briefing concluded with individual equipment inspections and final questions about the mission parameters. Danny's medical kit received particular scrutiny from both Rivera and the company medic, a veteran sergeant named Walsh, who typically remained at base during patrol operations. You've got good coverage for trauma injuries, Walsh observed, examining Danny's supply inventory. Extra morphine, plenty of 4 supplies, adequate pressure dressings. But remember, in that heat, dehydration and heat exhaustion can be just as dangerous as enemy fire. Make sure you're monitoring the other soldiers for signs of heat-related illness. Danny appreciated Walsh's professional assessment and advice. The older medic had been respectful but distant during Danny's first months at Camp Liberty, neither encouraging nor discouraging his ambitions for combat operations. Now faced with Danny's upcoming real-world test, Walsh seemed genuinely concerned about ensuring his success. One more thing, Walsh added quietly, so only Danny could hear. If things go wrong out there, if you're dealing with serious casualties under fire, remember your training but trust your instincts. Sometimes the textbook solution isn't the right solution for the specific situation you're facing. That night, Danny lay in his bunk reviewing medical procedures one final time, but his mind kept drifting to broader questions about courage, competence, and belonging. Tomorrow would determine whether his months of training and preparation had transformed him into the kind of medic his unit needed, or whether his simulation success had been an isolated achievement that couldn't be replicated under genuine combat. Conditions. The departure came earlier than scheduled. At 0530, Rivera's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness of the barracks. Rise and shine, ladies. Intel reports suggest increased insurgent activity along our route. We're moving out 30 minutes early to avoid predictable timing. Danny's adrenaline spiked as he completed his final equipment checks and joined the other soldiers at the vehicle staging area. Their patrol would consist of 3 up-armored Humvees, each carrying 4 soldiers and equipped with mounted machine guns for protection against ambush attacks. Danny found himself assigned to the middle vehicle with Rivera, Thompson, and Chun. The arrangement put him in the safest position within the convoy, but also placed him directly under Rivera's observation. Throughout the mission, every decision, every reaction, every moment of confidence or hesitation would be noted and evaluated. "Radio check," Chun announced as the vehicles prepared to depart. Danny tested his communications equipment, confirming clear contact with the other vehicles and base operations. His hands were steady, his voice clear, but internally he felt the familiar flutter of nervous energy that had plagued him. Throughout his deployment, the gates of Camp Liberty opened as the first hint of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, and Danny's first real combat patrol began with the rumble of diesel engines and the crunch of tires on gravel. The 3 Humvees moved out in tactical formation, maintaining proper spacing to minimize vulnerability to IED attacks while staying close. Enough to provide mutual support that the first few miles passed without incident through relatively secure territory close to the base. Danny used the time to familiarize himself with the patrol routine, observing how the other soldiers maintained situational awareness, communicated potential threats, and coordinated their movements through potentially dangerous terrain. "First checkpoint is coming up," Rivera announced through the internal communication system. "Everyone stay alert. This is where things start getting interesting." Checkpoint Alpha consisted of a small Iraqi police station surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. The local police were supposed to be friendly to coalition forces, but intelligence reports suggested that insurgent infiltration was possible. Among Iraqi security personnel, Rivera dismounted to conduct liaison activities with the Iraqi police commander while the other soldiers maintained security around the vehicles. Danny remained in the Humvee but kept his medical kit ready, understanding that even supposedly safe areas could become dangerous quickly in this environment. The meeting with Iraqi police lasted 15 minutes, during which Rivera gathered intelligence about recent insurgent activity and suspicious behavior in the surrounding area. When he returned to the vehicle, his expression was more serious than before. "Local police report increased IED activity along our route," Rivera announced. 3 separate incidents in the past week, all targeting coalition convoys. They're recommending we alter our planned route to avoid the most dangerous areas. Thompson checked his weapon systems and scanned the surrounding area through his window. "What do you think, Sarge? Take their advice or stick with the original plan?" Rivera studied his map for a moment before responding. "We'll stick with the original route but increase our alert level. The alternate routes haven't been cleared recently, so they might actually be more dangerous than the known threats along Route Tampa." Danny felt his pulse quicken as the convoy resumed movement toward the more dangerous sections of their patrol route. This was the transition point between relatively safe rear area operations and genuine combat conditions where insurgent attacks were not just possible but probable. The second checkpoint approached after 40 minutes of travel through increasingly hostile territory. Several times, the convoy had to slow down to navigate around potholes that might have concealed buried explosives, and twice they passed the burned-out hulks of vehicles destroyed in previous IED attacks, but it was during the approach to checkpoint Bravo that everything changed for Danny's patrol, and his carefully planned test of combat readiness became something much more serious and immediate than anyone had anticipated. The explosion, when it came, was nothing like the controlled simulations Danny had experienced during training. The sound was overwhelming, a thunderous crack that seemed to come from inside his own skull, followed immediately by the screech of twisted metal and breaking glass. The middle Humvee, Danny's vehicle, lurched violently to one side as shrapnel peppered its armored exterior. I'd. Rivera's voice cut through the chaos as the vehicle skidded to a stop. Everyone out. Establish a security perimeter. Danny's ears were ringing, his vision blurred by dust and debris, but his training kicked in automatically. He grabbed his medical kit and followed the other soldiers as they dismounted and took defensive positions around the damaged vehicles that the lead Humvee had taken the worst of the blast. Its front wheels were destroyed, its windshield was shattered, and smoke was rising from its engine compartment. Even worse, Danny could see soldiers inside who weren't moving and weren't responding to Rivera's shouted commands to establish security. Casualties in Vehicle 1. Chun reported through her radio. I need medical assistance immediately. This was it, Danny's moment of truth. Not in a controlled simulation with fake blood and pretend injuries, but in actual combat. Conditions with real wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention to survive. Danny sprinted toward the damaged Humvee, his medical training overriding every instinct that screamed at him to find cover and hide from potential follow-up attacks. Danny reached the damaged Humvee as bullets began striking the ground around him. The IED had been the opening move in. A coordinated ambush, insurgents positioned in nearby buildings were now pouring automatic weapons fire into the convoy's position. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper bark of American M4 rifles as his fellow soldiers returned fire from whatever cover they could find. The lead vehicle's interior was a nightmare of twisted metal, shattered glass, and blood. Private Collins, the driver, was slumped unconscious over the steering wheel with a severe head wound. Sergeant Martinez was trapped in the passenger seat, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle and blood soaking through his uniform from multiple shrapnel wounds. In the back, Specialist Brooks was conscious but screaming, his right leg nearly severed below the knee. "Danny, get those men out of there!" Rivera shouted from his position behind the middle vehicle, where he was coordinating the unit's defensive response. "We need to move before they bring up heavier weapons." Danny crawled through the Humvee's rear door, immediately beginning his triage assessment while bullets continued to whine overhead. Brooks was the most critically injured. His leg wound was arterial, and he was losing blood rapidly. Collins appeared to have a severe concussion but no immediately life-threatening injuries. Martinez was conscious and alert despite his obvious pain, suggesting his wounds were serious but not immediately fatal. "Brooks first," Danny muttered to himself, applying a tourniquet to the specialist's mangled leg. The bleeding slowed dramatically, buying precious time for more comprehensive treatment. "Can you hear me, Brooks? I need you to stay conscious while I work on you." Brooks nodded weakly, his face pale from blood loss and shock. Danny quickly established an IV line for fluid replacement, then moved to assess Martinez's condition more thoroughly. The sergeant's arm was definitely broken, probably in multiple places, and he had at least 3 shrapnel wounds in his torso that needed immediate attention. "How bad is it, Doc?" Martinez asked through gritted teeth. Despite his injuries, he was trying to maintain his weapon and contribute to the unit's defense. "You're going to be fine," Danny replied, applying pressure dressings to the worst of the shrapnel wounds. "But I need you to put that rifle down and let me work on you properly." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Thompson's heavy machine gun was providing covering fire from behind the middle vehicle, but the insurgents seemed to have positions in multiple buildings surrounding the convoy. Shun was frantically calling for helicopter evacuation and additional support while trying to coordinate the unit's defensive response. "We've got movement on the eastern rooftop," someone shouted. "RPG, take cover." The rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the convoy and exploded against a concrete wall 50 meters away, showering the area with debris. Danny instinctively hunched over his patients, shielding them with his own body while continuing to work on their injuries. Collins began stirring as Danny moved to assess his head wound. The driver's pupils were reactive and his responses seemed appropriate, suggesting the head injury might be less severe than initially feared. But he was clearly disoriented and would need careful monitoring for signs of traumatic brain injury. What happened? Collins mumbled, trying to sit up. Easy, Collins. You hit an IED, Danny explained while examining the laceration across the driver's forehead. I need you to stay still while I clean this wound. The sound of incoming helicopter rotors provided hope that evacuation might be possible, but the continued enemy fire made landing extremely dangerous. Danny could hear Rivera on the radio, coordinating with the air support to establish a secure landing zone, while maintaining defensive fire against insurgent positions. Medevac inbound. Chun announced. But they can't land until we clear those enemy positions on the east side. Danny realized he faced a critical decision. His 3 patients needed immediate evacuation to receive definitive medical care, but the helicopter couldn't safely land while insurgents maintained fire superiority around the landing zone. Someone would have to eliminate those enemy positions, and that would require soldiers who weren't busy treating casualties. Thompson, Danny called out. I need 10 minutes to get these men ready for evacuation. Can you suppress those eastern positions long enough for the helicopter to land? Thompson's response came between bursts of machine gun fire. I can try, but I'm running low on ammunition. And they've got us outnumbered. Danny looked at his 3 patients, all of whom were now stable enough for short-term transport, but would deteriorate rapidly without surgical intervention. Brooks' tourniquet was controlling his arterial bleeding, but prolonged application could result in limb loss. Martinez's internal injuries might be more serious than they appeared, and Collins needed a neurosurgical evaluation to rule out intracranial bleeding. Listen to me, Danny said, addressing all 3 wounded soldiers. I'm going to help clear those enemy positions so the helicopter can land. Stay here, keep pressure on your wounds, and wait for my signal to move to the landing zone. Brooks grabbed Danny's arm with surprising strength. Doc, you can't leave us. You're the medic. Your job is to stay with the casualties. Danny gently removed Brooks' hand from his arm. My job is to make sure you get the medical care you need to survive. Right now, that means making sure you can be evacuated. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel before anyone could stop him. Danny grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the eastern side of the convoy where Thompson was engaged with insurgent positions. The machine gunner looked surprised to see the medic joining the firefight, but quickly briefed him on the tactical situation. 3 positions, Thompson explained between bursts of fire. 1 in the 2-story building at 2 o'clock, another in the shop at 3 o'clock, and a third in that pile of rubble at 4 o'clock. I can suppress them, but I can't eliminate them from this angle. Danny studied the enemy positions, his mind working through possibilities. His small stature, which had been considered a disadvantage for so long, might actually allow him to maneuver into positions where larger soldiers couldn't go. The drainage ditch running along the eastern edge of the road could provide concealed movement toward the insurgent positions. Cover me, Danny said, checking his rifle and ammunition load. I'm going to flank them through that drainage ditch. Thompson looked at him with genuine concern. Danny, that's not your job. You're a medic, not an assault trooper. Right now I'm whatever my patients need me to be, Danny replied, then began moving toward the drainage ditch while Thompson provided covering fire. The ditch was barely 3 feet deep and filled with stagnant water and debris, but it offered concealment from the insurgent positions. Danny low-crawled through the filthy water, his medical training warring with infantry tactics as he maneuvered toward the enemy. Every few meters he paused to listen for movement and assess the tactical situation. The first insurgent position was in the ruins of a small shop, where at least 2 fighters were firing through windows at the American convoy. Danny managed to approach within 20 meters before being detected. When the shooting started, his medical training proved unexpectedly valuable. His knowledge of human anatomy made his return fire devastatingly accurate. The second position proved more challenging. The insurgent was well concealed in a pile of concrete rubble and had excellent fields of fire covering the convoy's position. Danny had to circle wide, exposing himself to fire from the third position, before finding an angle where he could engage effectively. The third insurgent, positioned in a 2-story building, had the tactical advantage of elevation and cover. Danny realized he would have to enter the building and clear it room by room, a dangerous prospect for any soldier, but especially challenging for someone with limited infantry training. But as Danny prepared to assault the building, he heard something that changed everything: the sound of additional helicopters approaching, and Rivera's voice on the radio coordinating a larger rescue operation. The ambush had grown beyond a simple eyed attack. This was a major engagement, involving multiple American units. "All stations, this is Overwatch 6, came a voice Danny didn't recognize through his radio headset. "We have Apache attack helicopters inbound to your position. Mark enemy targets and take cover." Danny looked up to see 2 H-64 Apache helicopters approaching from the west. Their 30mm chain guns and Hellfire missiles, capable of eliminating the remaining insurgent positions in seconds. His dangerous solo assault was no longer necessary. Air support would handle the tactical problem. But as he began withdrawing toward his wounded patients, Danny heard Brooks screaming. Not the controlled pain responses he'd been making earlier, but the kind of desperate, terrified screaming that indicated something had gone catastrophically wrong. Danny sprinted back toward the convoy, arriving to find Brooks in full cardiac arrest. The tourniquet had controlled his bleeding, but the combination of blood loss, shock, and prolonged field conditions had pushed his cardiovascular system beyond its limits. Martinez and Collins were stable, but Brooks was dying. He just collapsed. Martinez explained frantically, started convulsing, then stopped breathing. Danny immediately began cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but he knew that without advanced cardiac medications and defibrillation equipment, Brooks' chances were minimal. The specialist needed immediate surgical intervention and intensive care support that simply wasn't available in a combat zone. The Apache helicopters eliminated the remaining insurgent positions with precise missile strikes, allowing the medical evacuation helicopter to finally land safely. But as the flight medics rushed toward the casualties, Danny realized he was facing the most difficult moment of his military career. Brooks was clinically dead. Martinez and Collins were stable and would survive with proper medical care. The helicopter had room for 3 patients, but carrying a deceased soldier would mean using resources that could be dedicated to saving living casualties from other engagements in the area. "What's the status, soldier?" the lead flight medic asked as his team prepared to load the casualties. Danny looked at Brooks' still form, then at Martinez and Collins, who were both conscious and depending on him to make the right decision. Military medical protocol was clear. Treat the living first, recover the dead when resources permit. 2 urgent casualties ready for evacuation, Danny reported. Martinez has multiple shrapnel wounds and a compound arm fracture. Collins has a head injury requiring neurosurgical evaluation. "What about the third soldier?" the flight medic asked, noticing Brooks. Danny met the man's eyes, understanding the weight of what he was about to say. "Kier will recover the body when the area is secure." The helicopter lifted off with Martinez and Collins aboard, leaving Danny alone with Brooks' body and the rest of his unit. Rivera approached, having observed the entire medical response from his command position. "Tough call, Kowalski," Rivera said quietly, "but the right one. You saved 2 lives today." Danny stared at Brooks' covered form, feeling the crushing weight of his first combat loss. All his training, all his preparation, all his determination to prove himself worthy, and still, he hadn't been able to save everyone. I should have worked faster, Danny said. Should have recognized the cardiac symptoms earlier. Should have done exactly what you did, Rivera interrupted. You treated 3 critically wounded soldiers under enemy fire, eliminated insurgent positions that were preventing evacuation, and made life-or-death decisions that saved 2 men's lives. That's not failure, Kowalski. That's exceptional performance under the worst possible conditions. Thompson joined them, his machine gun finally silent now that the immediate threat had been eliminated. Danny, what you did today, ... I've never seen anything like it. You went from treating casualties to assaulting enemy positions and back to medical care without missing a beat. That's not just being a good medic, that's being a complete soldier. But Danny barely heard the praise. He was thinking about Brooks' wife and young son back in Georgia, about Martinez's grateful expression as the helicopter carried him to safety, about Colin's confused but trusting eyes as Danny cleaned his head wound. Combat, Danny realized, wasn't about proving yourself to skeptical sergeants or earning respect from fellow soldiers. It was about making impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure, carrying responsibilities that could never be fully prepared for, and living with the consequences of those decisions for the rest of your life. The convoy eventually made it back to Camp Liberty, but Danny Kowalski was no longer the same soldier who had left that morning, hoping to prove his worth in combat operations. He had become something else entirely, a combat veteran who understood that courage wasn't about being the biggest or strongest soldier, but about being willing to carry whatever burden was necessary to bring his brothers home alive. 3 weeks after the Route Tampa ambush, Danny found himself settling into a new rhythm at Camp Liberty. The successful medical response during the IED attack had transformed his status within Charlie Company, from questionable liability to respected team member. But the change brought unexpected challenges alongside the hard-won acceptance. The other soldiers no longer questioned his medical competence or his place in combat operations. If anything, they seemed to regard him with a mixture of professional respect and genuine affection that Danny had never experienced during his military service. Rodriguez regularly sought his advice about minor injuries and health concerns. Jackson made a point of including him in the informal conversations and card games that filled downtime between missions. Even Thompson, his former harshest critic, had become something approaching a protective older brother. But Danny struggled with the weight of expectations that came with his newfound reputation. The story of the medic who had treated 3 casualties under fire, then left his patients to eliminate enemy positions before returning to provide life-saving care, had spread throughout Camp Liberty and beyond. Soldiers from other units approached him for medical advice. Officers consulted him about tactical medical planning, and the base medical staff treated him as a peer rather than a newly arrived combat medic still learning his trade. The pressure was particularly intense because Danny knew his success during the ambush had been as much about desperate necessity as medical expertise. Brooks' death haunted him, not because he'd made the wrong decisions, but because he understood how easily different circumstances could have resulted in losing Martinez or Collins as well. Combat medicine, he was learning, involved as much luck as skill, and reputation could be destroyed as quickly as it was built. Staff Sergeant Rivera had recommended Danny for a Bronze Star for his actions during the Route Tampa engagement, and the formal recognition process was working its way through military channels. But more immediately important was Rivera's decision to make Danny the primary combat medic for all of Charlie Company's missions in their sector. "You've proven you can handle the pressure," Rivera explained during a private conversation in his office. "More importantly, you've shown you can make the hard decisions that combat medics have to make. The men trust you now, and that trust is something that can't be taught or faked." Danny appreciated Rivera's confidence, but he also understood the implications. As the unit's primary combat medic, he would be responsible for the medical care of 32 soldiers during increasingly dangerous missions in one of Iraq's most contested regions. Every patrol, every engagement, every emergency would place the lives of his fellow soldiers directly in his hands. The tactical situation in their sector had deteriorated significantly since the Route Tampa ambush. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent forces were becoming more organized, more aggressive, and more willing to engage American units in sustained firefights rather than hit-and-run attacks. The IED that had damaged their convoy was part of a larger pattern of coordinated attacks designed to isolate and destroy American patrols piecemeal. Captain Morrison briefed the company on these developments during their weekly intelligence update, his expression more serious than Danny had ever seen it. "We're facing a more sophisticated enemy than we encountered during our first months in this sector," Morrison announced. "They're using coordinated tactics, better weapons, and they seem to have detailed intelligence about our patrol routes and timing." Danny studied the map Morrison displayed, noting the locations of recent attacks and the patterns that suggested insurgent forces were learning to predict and counter American tactical responses. The implications for combat medical operations were sobering. Traditional casualty evacuation procedures assumed relatively secure landing zones and predictable enemy behavior. Neither assumption seemed valid any longer. "Medical considerations are particularly critical," Morrison continued, and Danny felt every eye in the briefing room turned toward him. "Recent engagement suggests insurgents are specifically targeting medics and wounded soldiers to maximize psychological impact and reduce our operational effectiveness." Rivera spoke up from his position near the front of the briefing room. "Kowalski has developed some innovative approaches to combat medical operations that might help address these new threats. Danny, want to share your thoughts with the company?" Danny stood, feeling the familiar flutter of nervousness that came with being the center of attention, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Based on what we experienced during the Route Tampa engagement, I think we need to modify our standard medical evacuation procedures to account for sustained enemy fire and compromised landing zones." He moved to the map, pointing out specific geographic features that could affect medical operations. Traditional doctrine calls for establishing secure perimeters around casualty collection points before calling for helicopter evacuation. But in these urban and semi-urban environments, insurgents can maintain fire on any potential landing zone from multiple concealed positions. The other soldiers listened intently as Danny outlined his proposed modifications to standard operating procedures. His suggestions were based on hard-won experience rather than textbook theory, and they addressed real problems the unit was likely to face in future engagements. "The key insight," Danny continued, "is that we need to be prepared to provide definitive medical care in the field rather than assuming rapid evacuation will always be possible. That means carrying more advanced medical supplies, cross-training soldiers in basic trauma care, and developing alternative evacuation routes that don't depend on helicopter access." The convoy halted at the designated insertion point, a small plaza on the city's eastern edge where the vehicles could be secured while the assault force moved on foot toward the target compound. Danny's heart rate spiked as soldiers began dismounting and forming up in their assigned tactical positions, but his hands remained steady as he conducted a final equipment check. "First platoon takes the northern approach." Morrison's voice cut through the pre-dawn air as he outlined the assault plan. "One final time. Second platoon secures the eastern side. Third platoon provides overwatch from the rooftops. Fourth platoon maintains our escape route back to the vehicles. Kowalski, you're with the assault element entering the compound." Lieutenant Hayes, the company's executive officer, raised his hand with a question. "What about the weight penalty for carrying additional medical supplies?" We're already at the limit of what soldiers can carry during extended patrols. Danny had anticipated this concern. We can redistribute the load across the entire unit rather than concentrating everything in the medic's kit. Every soldier carries basic trauma supplies, tourniquets, pressure dressings, 4 fluids, while I carry the more specialized equipment for surgical procedures and advanced life support. The discussion continued for nearly an hour as Danny fielded questions about medical logistics, evacuation procedures, and tactical considerations for operating in increasingly hostile environments. By the end of the briefing, several of his suggestions had been adopted as standard operating procedures for Charlie Company's future missions, but the real test of Danny's evolving role came 2 days later when Charlie Company received orders for their most dangerous mission since arriving in Iraq. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, a senior insurgent commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout their sector, operating from a compound in the city of Al-Rashid, 15 miles northeast of Camp Liberty. The mission profile was unlike anything Danny had participated in previously. Instead of a routine patrol with predictable routes and timing, this would be a deliberate assault on a heavily defended position in urban terrain, where insurgent forces had significant advantages in terms of local knowledge, prepared positions, and civilian cover. "This is a company-level operation," Morrison announced during the mission briefing. 4 platoons coordinated assault, with the objective of capturing or eliminating the target and any associated personnel. Expected resistance is heavy, and evacuation options will be limited due to the urban environment. Danny studied the aerial photographs of Al-Rashid, noting the narrow streets, multi-story buildings, and dense civilian population that would complicate both tactical operations and medical evacuations. Traditional helicopter landing zones would be impossible within the city, meaning wounded soldiers would have to be carried to extraction points on the outskirts, potentially under fire, and over significant distances. Rivera outlined the medical plan during a separate briefing for the platoon leaders and key personnel. Kowalski will accompany the assault element with enhanced medical supplies for trauma surgery. Each platoon will have a soldier cross-trained in advanced first aid, and we've established 3 potential evacuation routes leading to secure areas outside the city. But Danny knew the real challenge wouldn't be logistical, it would be psychological. Al-Rashid was known as an insurgent stronghold where American forces were unwelcome and civilian cooperation was minimal. Unlike the Route Tampa engagement, where they'd been responding to an unexpected attack, this mission involved deliberately entering a hostile environment where enemy forces would have every advantage. The night before the mission, Danny lay in his bunk reviewing medical procedures and trying to prepare mentally for what lay ahead. His experiences during the Route Tampa ambush had given him confidence in his technical abilities, but Al-Rashid would present challenges that no amount of training could fully prepare him for. Thompson approached his bunk around midnight, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a soldier who had something important to say. "Mind if I sit down, Doc?" Danny accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Thompson had started calling him Doc rather than Kowalski, a sign of respect that still felt strange coming from the big soldier who had once doubted his every capability. "I wanted to talk to you about tomorrow," Thompson said quietly, mindful of the other sleeping soldiers around them. "This mission is different from anything we've done before. More dangerous, more complicated, and with a lot less room for error." Danny nodded, understanding Thompson's concerns. "I know. I've been thinking about the same things." "The thing is," Thompson continued, "after what you did on Route Tampa, the men are looking to you for more than just medical care. They're looking for leadership, for confidence, for someone who can keep his head when everything goes to hell." Danny felt the weight of that expectation settling on his shoulders. "I'm just trying to do my job, Marcus. Take care of anyone who gets hurt." "That's exactly what I mean," Thompson replied. "You don't see it, but the rest of us do. When you're working on casualties, when you're making those life and death decisions, you become someone different. Someone stronger, more confident, more capable than you seem to think you are. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, drinking their coffee and listening to the nighttime sounds of Camp Liberty, generators humming, guards walking their posts, the distant rumble of vehicles returning from late patrols. "Can I ask you something?" Danny said eventually. "Do you ever wonder if we're making a difference here? If all this fighting and risk and sacrifice is actually helping anyone?" Thompson considered the question carefully before answering. "I think about it all the time. But then I remember soldiers like Martinez and Collins, who are alive today because you were there when they needed you. That's not abstract. That's real people with real families who get to go home because you did your job." Danny thought about Martinez, who had sent him a letter from the military hospital in Germany, where he was recovering from his injuries. The sergeant's arm would never be completely normal, but he would return to his wife and children in El Paso, with full use of his limbs and a grateful appreciation for the medic who had saved his life. "Tomorrow is going to be different," Thompson said, standing to leave. "More dangerous, more complicated. But I want you to know that every soldier in this company trusts you completely. When things get bad, and they will get bad, we know you'll be there." As Thompson walked back to his own bunk, Danny reflected on the transformation he'd undergone since arriving at Camp Liberty 8 months earlier. The nervous, uncertain soldier who had struggled with basic medical procedures had evolved into someone his fellow soldiers depended on for their lives. But more than that, he'd discovered reserves of courage and competence that he'd never known he possessed. The mission to Al-Rashid would test all of those qualities, and Danny understood that the stakes were higher than ever, not just for his own reputation or career, but for the lives of 32 soldiers who trusted him to bring them home alive. Tomorrow would determine whether Danny Kowalski had truly become the combat medic his unit needed, or whether his previous successes had been the product of luck rather than genuine capability. But for the first time since arriving in Iraq, Danny felt genuinely ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The convoy rolled out of Camp Liberty at 0430 hours, under cover of darkness and with complete radio silence to avoid alerting insurgent forces to their approach. Danny sat in the lead vehicle with Rivera, Thompson, and Chun, his enhanced medical kit secured between his feet and his rifle checked for the 3rd time since departure. The weight of additional medical supplies, surgical instruments, blood products, advanced pharmaceuticals pressed against his back, but he barely noticed the physical burden compared to the psychological weight of knowing that 32 lives might depend on his decisions in the coming hours. Al-Rashid appeared on the horizon as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, a sprawling collection of concrete buildings, narrow streets, and flat rooftops that had sheltered insurgent forces for months. Intelligence reports suggested the target compound was located in the city's center, surrounded by civilian structures and accessible only through choke point streets that could easily become kill zones if the mission went wrong. "Remember," Rivera's voice crackled through their headsets as the convoy approached the city's outskirts. "This is a capture mission if possible, elimination if necessary. But our primary objective is getting everyone home alive. If the situation becomes untenable, we extract immediately." Danny studied the urban landscape through his vehicle's armored windows, noting potential cover positions, evacuation routes, and the ominous absence of civilian activity despite the early morning hour. Al-Rashid's streets were empty in a way that suggested the local population knew something was about to happen and had made themselves scarce. Danny nodded, understanding that his position in the assault force meant he would be among the first soldiers to enter the target building, exactly where casualties were most likely to occur, but also where immediate medical attention would be most critical. His small stature, which had once been considered a liability, would allow him to move through the compound's narrow corridors and tight spaces more easily than larger soldiers. The approach through al-Rashid streets was eerily quiet, with only the soft shuffle of boots on concrete and the occasional hand signal from Rivera as the assault force navigated toward their objective. Danny found himself between Thompson and Rodriguez, both of whom had volunteered to provide close security for the unit's medic during the most dangerous phase of the operation. "Target building, 50 meters, Rivera whispered through their communications. System as a 3-story concrete structure came into view. Intelligence photos had shown the compound's layout, but seeing it in person revealed additional challenges: multiple entrances, countless windows that could conceal sniper positions, and rooftop access that would allow defenders to maintain fire superiority even after American forces entered the building. That's when the first shot cracked across the morning air, and Danny's world transformed into chaos. The gunfire came from multiple directions simultaneously. Muzzle flashes from windows, rooftops, and concealed positions that suggested the insurgents had been expecting their arrival. The assault force immediately took cover behind vehicles, concrete barriers, and building corners as automatic weapons fire filled the air around them. "Ambush! Ambush!" Rivera's voice cut through the din of gunfire. "All units, we have multiple enemy positions surrounding the target building. Request immediate air support." Danny pressed himself against a concrete wall as bullets struck the surface inches from his head. But his attention was focused on Thompson, who had stumbled and was now lying motionless in the middle of the street. Blood was spreading beneath the big soldier's torso, and his rifle lay several feet away where it had fallen when he was hit. "Thompson's down." Danny called into his radio. "I need covering fire to reach him." "Negative." Rivera's response was immediate. "Too much fire. Too exposed. Wait for suppression." But Danny could see Thompson trying to move, could see the spreading pool of blood that indicated arterial damage requiring immediate intervention. Waiting for covering fire might mean watching his friend and fellow soldier bleed to death in the street while American forces established fire superiority, a process that could take precious minutes. Thompson didn't have. Danny made his decision without consulting anyone. He sprinted into the open street, his medical bag bouncing against his back as bullets filled the air around him. The distance to Thompson felt infinite, but he reached the wounded soldier and immediately began his assessment while using Thompson's larger body as partial cover from the heaviest fire. "Where are you hit?" Danny asked as he began cutting away Thompson's uniform to expose the wound. The entry point was in the soldier's lower abdomen, with significant bleeding that suggested damage to major blood vessels or organs. "Feels like someone hit me with a sledgehammer," Thompson replied through gritted teeth. "Can't feel my legs, Doc." Danny's hands worked automatically, applying pressure to control the bleeding while his mind processed the implications of Thompson's symptoms. The bullet trajectory and neurological signs suggested possible spinal cord involvement, a catastrophic injury that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent paralysis. But before Danny could establish an 4-line or begin advanced treatment procedures, a new crisis developed. Rodriguez, who had been providing covering fire from a position near the target building, suddenly cried out and fell backward. From Danny's position in the street, he could see blood on Rodriguez's chest and arm, and the soldier wasn't moving. "Rodriguez is hit," Chun's voice crackled through the radio. "I need medical assistance at the northeast corner." Danny found himself facing an impossible situation. Thompson needed immediate, continuous medical attention to survive his abdominal wound and possible spinal injury. But Rodriguez appeared to have been shot in the chest, potentially a sucking chest wound that would be fatal within minutes without proper treatment. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly around them. Enemy fire was intensifying rather than diminishing, suggesting reinforcements were arriving to support the compound's defenders. American forces were taking casualties faster than they could establish fire superiority, and evacuation would be impossible until the immediate area could be secured. Danny. Rivera's voice cut through the chaos. Status report. How many casualties do we have? Danny pressed his radio transmit button while maintaining pressure on Thompson's wound. 2 confirmed. Casualties, both critical. Thompson has an abdominal wound with possible spinal involvement. Rodriguez appears to have chest trauma. I can treat one effectively, but not both simultaneously. The silence that followed Danny's report seemed to stretch forever, though it probably lasted only seconds. Every soldier listening understood the implication. Their medic was being forced to choose which of their brothers would receive life-saving treatment and which might die while waiting. Can Thompson be moved? Rivera asked. Danny assessed his patient's condition quickly. Thompson was conscious and stable for the moment, but moving him without proper spinal precautions could cause permanent paralysis if his spinal cord was damaged. On the other hand, Rodriguez's chest wound might be immediately fatal without intervention. Moving Thompson could cause permanent paralysis, Danny reported. But Rodriguez won't survive more than a few minutes without treatment. Through his rifle scope, Danny could see Rodriguez lying motionless near the target building, blood spreading across his chest. The soldier's breathing appeared labored, suggesting a tension pneumothorax, a condition where air pressure builds up in the chest cavity, preventing the lungs from expanding properly. Without immediate decompression, Rodriguez would suffocate despite having a clear airway. Danny made the most difficult decision of his military career. Thompson, I need you to maintain pressure on this wound. I'm going to Rodriguez. Doc, don't leave me, Thompson whispered, fear evident in his voice despite his efforts to remain calm. I'll be back, Danny promised, though he had no idea if he could keep that commitment. Just keep pressure on the wound and stay conscious. Danny sprinted toward Rodriguez's position, drawing fire from multiple enemy positions, but somehow reaching the wounded soldier without being hit. Rodriguez was indeed suffering from a tension pneumothorax, his breathing shallow and rapid as air pressure built up in his chest cavity. Working with desperate efficiency, Danny located the correct insertion point and performed a needle decompression to relieve the pressure in Rodriguez's chest. The procedure required precise placement to avoid damaging major blood vessels, but Danny's knowledge of human anatomy made his movements confident, despite the bullets striking the concrete around them. Better? Danny asked as Rodriguez's breathing improved dramatically. Rodriguez nodded, color returning to his face as his oxygen levels stabilized. Much better, Doc. I thought I was going to die there for a minute, but Danny's relief was short-lived. From his new position, he could see Thompson lying in the street where he'd left him, and the big soldier appeared to be losing consciousness. The abdominal wound was bleeding more heavily, and Thompson's attempts to maintain pressure were becoming weaker as shock set in. Danny realized he was facing the ultimate test of combat medicine, not just treating casualties under fire, but managing multiple critical patients simultaneously while enemy forces maintained fire superiority around their positions. Everything he'd learned, every skill he'd developed, every moment of confidence he'd built would be needed in the next few minutes. Chun, Danny called into his radio. I need you to move to Thompson's position and maintain pressure on his abdominal wound. Can you do that? Negative. Chun's response came immediately. Too much fire between my position and the street. Danny looked around desperately for options. Rodriguez was stable for the moment, but would need continuous monitoring to ensure his chest decompression remained effective. Thompson was deteriorating rapidly and would die without immediate surgical intervention. And somewhere in the chaos of the firefight, other soldiers might be wounded and calling for medical assistance. That's when Danny heard the sound that changed everything, the distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds, followed by explosions that shook the ground and filled the air with debris and smoke. The insurgents had brought up indirect fire weapons, transforming the urban firefight into something approaching a major battle. Incoming! Incoming! Multiple voices shouted the warning simultaneously as more mortar rounds impacted around American positions. Danny threw himself over Rodriguez to shield the wounded soldier from flying debris, but he could see Thompson lying exposed in the street, as shrapnel and concrete fragments filled the air around them. The mortar attack lasted only 30 seconds, but when the smoke cleared, Danny faced a nightmare scenario that would test every skill he'd learned as a combat medic. 3 more soldiers had been wounded by the mortar fire. Thompson was unconscious and bleeding more heavily than before. Rodriguez needed continuous monitoring to prevent his chest wound from deteriorating. And enemy small arms fire continued from positions that seemed to surround the American force. Completely docked Danny Kowalski, the soldier who had once been considered too small and too nervous for combat operations, now found himself responsible for keeping 5 critically wounded men alive while his unit fought for survival in the streets of Al-Rashid. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that separates adequate medics from exceptional ones. And Danny was about to discover which category he truly belonged in. Danny moved through the smoke and debris like a man possessed, his medical training overriding every instinct for self-preservation as he assessed the new casualties created by the mortar attack. Specialist Jenkins had taken shrapnel to his left shoulder and was conscious but bleeding steadily. Private Martinez lay unconscious with what appeared to be a severe head wound from flying concrete. Corporal Williams was sitting upright but clutching his abdomen, blood seeping between his fingers from an internal injury that could be immediately life-threatening. The tactical situation had become desperate. American forces were pinned down by accurate small arms fire from multiple directions. Mortar rounds were falling with increasing frequency, and Danny now had 5 wounded soldiers requiring immediate medical attention in the middle of an active battlefield. "All stations, this is Overwatch 6, a voice crackled through Danny's radio headset. "We have fast movers inbound with close air support. Mark your positions and prepare for danger close strikes on the target building." Danny understood the implications immediately. Close air support, not F-16s or A-10s, would be dropping bombs or firing cannons at insurgent positions within a few hundred meters of American forces. The airstrikes would eliminate many of the enemy positions causing casualties, but they would also create massive secondary explosions and debris that could kill wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved to safe positions. "Rivera," Danny called into his radio while applying pressure dressings to Jenkins' shoulder wound. "I have 5 casualties who can't be moved before the airstrikes. We need immediate evacuation or they won't survive the secondary effects." "Understood." Rivera's response came between bursts of rifle fire. "Working on extraction options now." But Danny knew there were no good options. Traditional helicopter evacuation was impossible with enemy forces controlling multiple rooftop positions around their location. Ground evacuation would require carrying wounded soldiers through streets swept by automatic weapons fire. And staying in place meant exposing his patients to the devastating effects of close air support operations. Thompson had regained consciousness, but was clearly going into shock from his abdominal wound. Rodriguez's chest decompression was holding, but he needed surgical intervention to repair the underlying lung damage. The 3 newest casualties required varying levels of immediate care to prevent their conditions from deteriorating into life-threatening emergencies. Danny made a decision that would have seemed impossible 8 months earlier when he first arrived at Camp Liberty. He would have to perform field surgery on multiple patients simultaneously while under fire, using techniques and procedures that were normally reserved for fully equipped operating rooms with teams of specialists. "Chun," Danny called the communications specialist. "I need you to establish contact with the nearest surgical hospital." Get me a trauma surgeon on the radio who can talk me through emergency procedures. While Chun worked to establish medical communications, Danny began setting up a makeshift surgical area using whatever cover was available. A destroyed vehicle provided partial protection from small arms fire, while scattered concrete blocks created additional barriers against shrapnel and debris. "Thompson, I need you to stay conscious and help me," Danny said as he prepared emergency surgical supplies. "You're going to talk Rodriguez through maintaining pressure on his chest while I work on the others." "Doc, I can barely feel my hands." Thompson replied weakly, "I don't think I can help much." "You can and you will," Danny said firmly. "Because Rodriguez needs you, and I need you, and we're all getting out of here alive." Danny's confidence seemed to transfer to his patient. Thompson nodded and began giving Rodriguez instructions about monitoring his own breathing and watching for signs that his chest decompression was failing. The first airstrike hit the target building with devastating effect, the explosion so powerful that Danny felt the shockwave in his chest from 300 meters away. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel stored in the building detonated, sending debris raining down on the American positions. Danny threw himself over Martinez to protect the unconscious soldier from falling concrete, then immediately returned to his medical procedures. Martinez's head wound was bleeding profusely, but didn't appear to have penetrated the skull. A serious injury that would require neurological monitoring, but wasn't immediately fatal. "This is Colonel Peterson, trauma surgeon at Ballard Air Base." A calm voice came through Chun's radio. "I understand you have multiple casualties requiring emergency surgical intervention in the field." Danny keyed his radio while continuing to cook. "Work on Williams' abdominal wound." "Yes, sir." "I have 5 wounded soldiers, 2 critical, 3 urgent. I'm attempting to perform trauma surgery with limited equipment under combat conditions." "Understood." "What's your medical background, soldier?" "Combat medic, sir." "Standard training plus 8 months field experience." There was a pause before the colonel responded, "Son, what you're attempting is extremely dangerous for the patients and beyond the scope of standard medic training. But if they can't be evacuated, you may be their only chance. I'm going to talk you through some emergency procedures." For the next 20 minutes, Danny performed medical procedures he'd never attempted before under the radio guidance of a surgeon 300 miles away. He successfully stopped Williams' internal bleeding using techniques normally reserved for operating rooms. He stabilized Martinez's head injury and established an 4-line to reduce brain swelling. He managed Jenkins' shoulder wound and monitored it for signs of arterial damage, all while mortar rounds continued to fall around there. Position and rifle fire cracked overhead from insurgent positions that somehow survived the airstrikes. "How are you doing down there?" Colonel Peterson's voice carried genuine concern and professional admiration. "All patients are stable for now," Danny reported while checking Thompson's vital signs. "But I need evacuation soon, or they'll start deteriorating beyond what I can handle in the field." "Roger, I've been monitoring your radio traffic with command. They're working on extraction options now." The extraction, when it finally came, was unlike anything Danny had experienced during his deployment. Instead of traditional helicopter evacuation, a convoy of heavily armored vehicles fought their way through al-Rashid streets to reach the pinned-down American forces, but loading 5 critically wounded soldiers into armored vehicles while under fire required splitting them between multiple vehicles, meaning Danny couldn't provide continuous medical care to all his patients during the evacuation. "Rodriguez and Williams in Vehicle 1, Danny called out as the evacuation began. "Jenkins and Martinez in Vehicle 2. Thompson comes with me in Vehicle 3. "Doc, what if something happens during the ride?" Rodriguez asked as soldiers loaded him onto a stretcher. "You're going to be fine," Danny replied, though he felt the familiar knot of anxiety about decisions beyond his control. Chun's trained in advanced first aid, and the ride to base is only 20 minutes. The convoy fought its way back through Al-Rashid under sporadic sniper fire and one final mortar attack that damaged the trailing vehicle but didn't create additional casualties. Danny spent the evacuation monitoring Thompson's condition while coordinating radio communications with the medical team preparing to receive his patients at Camp Liberty's aid station. Base Medical, this is Bravo 4, Danny reported as the convoy approached Camp Liberty's main gate, inbound with 5 casualties, 2 critical ones requiring immediate surgery, 3 urgent ones requiring trauma evaluation. ETA is 3 minutes. Roger, Bravo 4, we have surgical teams standing by and helicopters on deck for transport to higher care facilities. The next several hours passed in a blur of medical procedures, evacuation flights, and after-action reports. Danny found himself in the unusual position of briefing senior medical officers about field surgical techniques he performed under combat conditions, procedures that would normally require years of additional training and specialized equipment. Sergeant Kowalski, the base medical officer, said during the debriefing, "What you accomplished in Al-Rashid goes far beyond standard combat medic capabilities. You essentially established a field surgical hospital under enemy fire and kept 5 critically wounded soldiers alive until evacuation was possible." Danny was too exhausted to feel much satisfaction about the praise. His hands, which had been rock steady during the crisis, were now shaking from adrenaline reaction and physical exhaustion. All he could think about was whether his patients would survive their injuries and return to their families. The answer came over the following days as updates arrived from the military hospitals treating his evacuated patients. Thompson would recover completely from his abdominal wound with no permanent effects. The bullet had missed his spine and major organs. Rodriguez's lung had been successfully repaired, and he would return to duty within 6 weeks. Williams required additional surgery, but was expected to make a full recovery. Martinez had no lasting neurological damage from his head injury. Jenkins' shoulder wound was healing normally with no complications. 5 soldiers who should have died in Al-Rashid would instead return home to their families because a medic who had once been considered too small and too nervous for combat operations had refused to accept that anyone under his care was beyond saving. The Bronze Star citation arrived 2 weeks later, along with promotion orders to Staff Sergeant and reassignment to the military's premier combat medic school as an instructor. But the recognition that meant the most to Danny came from his fellow soldiers, the men who had witnessed his transformation from questionable liability to exceptional combat medic. "You know what I learned from watching you in Al-Rashid?" Thompson said during his final conversation with Danny before being medically evacuated to Germany. "I learned that being a soldier isn't about how big you are or how strong you are. It's about how much you're willing to sacrifice for the people depending on you." Rodriguez, despite his injured lung, made a point of visiting Danny before his own evacuation. "Doc, when I was lying there with that chest wound, I thought I was going to die. But then you showed up, and somehow I knew everything was going to be okay." That kind of confidence, that kind of caring, that's what makes the difference between a good medic and a great one. Even Rivera, who had been skeptical about Danny's capabilities for so long, offered his final assessment with genuine respect and admiration. "Kowalski, when you first arrived at Camp Liberty, I thought you were a liability the unit couldn't afford to carry. I was wrong. You're not just a good combat medic, you're the kind of soldier who makes everyone around him better, stronger, more confident." 6 months later, Danny stood in front of 30 combat medic students at Fort Sam Houston, teaching advanced trauma care to soldiers preparing for deployment. His students were bigger, stronger, and more physically impressive than their instructor. But they listened intently as Danny shared lessons learned from treating casualties under fire in places like Route Tampa and Al-Rashid. "The most important thing you need to understand," Danny told his students during a particularly intense training session, is that being a combat medic isn't about having perfect technique or memorizing every medical procedure. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes to bring your fellow soldiers home alive. He looked around the classroom, seeing in his students' faces the same mixture of nervousness and determination he'd felt during his own training years earlier. Some would struggle with self-doubt, as he had. Others would face skepticism about their physical capabilities or their suitability for combat operations. You don't have to be the biggest soldier in your unit, Danny continued. You don't have to be the strongest or the fastest or the most naturally gifted. But you do have to be willing to carry your brothers when they can't carry themselves. And sometimes that means carrying them literally through gunfire, across battlefields, up to helicopter landing zones, where they can get the care they need to survive. Danny thought about Thompson, Rodriguez, Williams, Martinez, and Jenkins. 5 soldiers who were alive today because he'd been willing to carry them when they couldn't carry themselves. It had taken him months to understand that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the soldier who looked least capable of carrying others was exactly the one who would refuse to leave anyone behind. The lesson had cost him everything he thought he knew about himself, but it had taught him something invaluable about courage, competence, and the true meaning of brotherhood among soldiers who depended on each other for survival in the most dangerous places on Earth. 2 years after leaving Iraq, Danny received a letter that made him stop everything he was doing. It was written in careful English by Ahmad Hassan, a young Iraqi man who had been wounded during the Battle of al-Rashid and treated by American medics at a field hospital. Sergeant Kowalski, the letter began, I do not know if you remember me, but I was the civilian who was brought to your medical station after the fighting in my city. The doctors told me that an American medic had saved several soldiers that day, and that same medic had insisted they treat Iraqi civilians with the same care. Danny remembered. During the chaos of treating his 5 wounded soldiers, several Iraqi civilians had been brought to their makeshift medical station. Despite the tactical situation and limited supplies, Danny had insisted on providing medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of nationality. I am writing to tell you that I am now studying to become a doctor, Ahmad continued. I was inspired by the American soldiers who risked their lives to help strangers. I want to become the kind of doctor who saves lives the way you saved mine and so many others. Danny smiled as he finished reading the letter. The young man's words reminded him why he'd become a medic in the first place, not for recognition or awards, but for the simple opportunity to help people when they needed it most. That evening, Danny stood before another class of combat medic students, sharing the letter and the lesson it represented. This is why we do what we do, he told them. Not just to save American soldiers, but to show the world that strength isn't about size or power. It's about the willingness to help others, no matter the cost. What did you think of Danny's incredible journey from doubt to heroism? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment inspired you most? If stories like this motivate you to push through your own challenges, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got more incredible tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things coming your way.